arriving. If I could remind you to keep your cameras and microphones off just now, if that's okay. So welcome, my name's Heather Gray and I'm the Head of Physiotherapy and Paramedicine at Glasgow Caledonian University, and I'm going to be hosting the webinar today. This webinar is part of the current enhancement theme on resilient learning communities. Enhancement themes are funded by QAAS Scotland and delivered in collaboration with Scottish sector institutions. And this webinar today is the first in a series of 4 professional development events as part of the collaborative cluster on student mental wellbeing and the curriculum. So this is a continuation, as many of you know, of the successful cluster that we ran last year. And this year we have a focus in particular on our BAME and LGBTQ+ student learner communities. The cluster has been led by Glasgow Caledonian University in collaboration with NUS Scotland, the University of Stirling, Scotland's Rural College, Sparks, and Edinburgh Napier University. And today we're delighted to have 2 excellent speakers joining with us. So first of all, we have Amatey Doku from NUS Group, who will be focusing his presentation on our BAME learner communities. And this will be followed by Dominic Smithies from Student Minds, whose presentation will speak to our LGBTQ+ learner communities. We will have some opportunities for questions after each of the presentations. So please make use of the chat function to post any questions that you might have for our presenters. Additionally, feel free to use the chat function to highlight any resources that you feel might help others. And what we can do is we can then add them to the resources that we're collating and posting on our collaborative cluster website. Finally, just for noting, we are going to be recording this session today, which also for noting records the chat function as well. And what we'll do is we'll make the recordings available on the cluster site after the webinar. And for those who are using Twitter, the hashtag for today is #ThemesWellbeing. So if I can ask people to, again, just remind you about keeping mics muted and cameras off. And without any further delay, what I'll do is I'll hand over to Amatey just now, if that's okay. Over to you, Amatey.
Brilliant, thank you, Heather, and thanks for that introduction. It's really good to be here today, and I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes or so talking about the needs and the importance of creating an inclusive curriculum and why that's such an important part of mental well-being for BAME students. Just a quick introduction to myself. As Heather said, I'm a consultant at NUS, working in both higher education and health, inequality, diversity, and inclusion, amongst other things, such as university strategy, student experience. But before that, I worked at NUS, National Union of Students, where I co-chaired the NUS UK Closing the Gap report. So I'm really pleased to have been invited here today. Those are my details at the bottom if you do want to get in touch, either via email or you're more than welcome to follow me on Twitter when I occasionally do say something of interest. So what we'll cover today, the first thing I'm really keen to look at is thinking about that wider context. I'm conscious that people on the call are likely to have a bit more context around some of this stuff, so I'm not going to take too much time on it, but I think it's important to put the wider context of tackling racial inequality alongside the conversation around curriculum specifically. I'll talk very briefly around some of the anti-race agendas. So what are the policies and strategies and initiatives underway to tackle racial inequality, just to sort of situate where the conversations around the curriculum sit. And then a final aspect, which will take up the bulk of the time, which is looking at that piece on decolonising the curriculum. So what is it and how do you do it effectively, and how does it link to mental health and mental well-being for students? So just very quickly, the wider context, just 2 pictures, contrasting pictures, one from many years ago in a university context, and one from, I was going to say more recently, but certainly more recently than the picture before, back when face-to-face lectures were allowed. The point trying to make is that, you know, that there's a lot of talk about how universities have changed, which is true. They've changed dramatically over time, but in some cases, the underlying way in which teaching is delivered has stayed fairly the same. And that's important when thinking about the curriculum and how the curriculum is delivered, that actually, in terms of the way in which we do things at university, a lot of things have stayed the same. And that's really important from thinking from the point of view of understanding what decolonising the curriculum is all about, creating inclusive curricula. It's about really challenging some of the assumptions about how our institutions work and have worked for a very long time. So we've got a lot of racial inequalities in higher education today. These are some of the ones, I'm sure there are more, but these are some of the ones that I thought I'd pull out. We've got a 26% attainment gap, or more commonly now known as the awarding gap, between white students and black students for that figure in particular, but for BAME students as a whole, there are also gaps. Noting that many of you will be aware the limitations of those catch-all terms such as BAME and students of colour, and making sure that when you use them, you don't use them to mask the inequalities between the different racial groupings as well. But racial harassment and reporting structures not being up to scratch, few black senior leaders in the HE sector, poor progression pipeline, lower continuation rates, microaggressions and overt racism, but of course the Eurocentric curriculum. That is all part of a broader challenge that we have in the higher education sector around racial inequality. And just to sort of put the conversations that we'll have today about the curriculum into context, the Eurocentric curriculum is part of the broader picture there, which leads to those inequalities and for many students a lack of sense of belonging. And I'll talk about what impacts those inequalities taken together have on students, has an impact on attainment, which I touched on already, has a real impact on a lack of sense of belonging, a real issue with on mental well-being consequently as a result of those things, and an issue on progression. So that's both progression to academic opportunities, but also outside. And this quotation here is from the Closing the Gap report, which I was involved in when I was at NUS working with Universities UK. Really highlights there. We were very keen to centre the experiences of students at the heart of this, and it's very clear there that lack of sense of belonging was something that really came through. And then a second quote here as well, really highlighting. In a sense, I'll talk about this in a second. Sort of the alienation that can come from being a BAME student in an institution in the UK. So what are universities doing about it? Well, debates are alive and well. There are sector-wide regulations and initiatives in place. Sector leaders are taking the issue more seriously. We've had lots of reports from the EHRC, University UK, as I mentioned, and at an institution level as well. So Glasgow University recently published their reports, which highlighted instances of racism. I would say that there has been a lack of comprehensive institution-wide approaches on the whole, but I am optimistic that is starting to change. And what do those initiatives look like? BAME counsellors, report and support tools, anti-racism strategies, safe spaces, cultural awareness training, going beyond unconscious bias training, mentoring opportunities, new senior appointments as well, and decolonising the curriculum. So wanted to just put all that into context to make it clear that when we're talking about the curriculum, that isn't the silver bullet here, but it's an important part of a much broader agenda, which I'm sure lots of people are aware of, but just thought I'd put that there as context. A couple of key points: if you are involved in this work, make sure it's an institution-wide approach. Make sure the experiences of BAME students and staff are centred. Make sure it's you've got the right expertise. If you don't have it in-house, make sure you look for it and then resource it effectively. That applies when tackling racial inequalities as a whole, but it also applies when looking at the curriculum more specifically, which I'll go on to now. So decolonising the curriculum. Well, the reality is we've got to understand where we're starting from. If you think back to the picture that I presented earlier of the lecture hall, which perhaps hasn't changed as much as we would have expected to over time, and the delivery of education, we've got to understand that the existing curricula in higher education institutions can be alienating for BAME students. and in a lot of the work I've been doing which has involved consulting BAME students on their experiences, these are some of the key themes that come up specifically about the curriculum, that they don't see themselves represented in the canon. So in terms of what on reading lists, in terms of the key figures or theorists or thinkers that are presented as sort of really important and critical to their disciplines, those people who are platformed by lecturers all look the same, white European on the whole. So BAME students, when they're coming into higher education, don't really see anyone who looks like them represented in the work that they're as I said, yeah, in the sort of theorists and thinkers in the canon that's presented by lecturers and by tutors. And then a second point, and this is a particular interesting area, particularly in the humanities and the arts, actually, that when BAME students present work that draws on their own heritage or background, it is valued less. And the first 2 points are obviously intimately linked, but this sense that either students have a reticence or a nervousness about presenting work from their background, but that's as a result of, you know, when they do, it's less understood by academics, it's less understood by the institution. In some cases, hearing students feel that their work has been marked down as a result, or that the academics haven't critically engaged with the diverse perspectives that they've sought to brought into their work. So that's a really important point. And then the final point is that the delivery of education is not sensitive to issues of race and racism. I think one thing that's really interesting that's happening these days is that young people are becoming more and more understanding and understand that culture and their history and their heritage, and sort of the expectations of you know, of that understanding is much better now as a result of the internet and the accessibility of knowledge, to then come into an institution where it is felt that there's a lack of understanding about race and racism, and there's a lack of understanding about the delivery of education in relation to race and racism as well, is really concerning. That's coming up time and time again in lots of the consultations we're doing. And I'd say that last point has a real significant impact on mental well-being. In some of the conversations that I've been having more recently with students, one of the ways in which this comes out is the lack of sensitivity when dealing with issues of race. Not putting trigger warnings when when race is being covered as part of the program, not even necessarily when race is being covered, but where there are you know, potentially graphic images of involving you know, one example, black bodies or racial slurs in academic texts, which might be seen as, you know, we're just, you know, looking at this from an academic point of view, but a real lack of understanding of the different ways in which that could be the different ways in which that could impact students from different backgrounds is a real concern. So there's a lot of work to do here, but this slide just sort of highlights some of the challenges with the existing curriculum. In terms of understanding decolonisation, conscious that some of you will have addressed this in other sessions before, but just wanted to sort of pick out a couple of quotes. The first one is helpful, a bit long-winded, so I'll whiz through it. But in terms of understanding decolonisation, which I should sort of preface this by saying, that has been a response to the existing curricula being alienating. So as a response to that, people have really sought to focus on decolonising and what it's about. But just a quick definition, which I find helpful. It is a way of thinking about the world which takes empire and racism as its empirical and discursive objectives of study. So it's a way of thinking about the world which says, right, we're going to focus on empire and racism, and resituates these phenomena as key shaping forces of the contemporary world. So that is to say, we're going to see empire and racism as important ways in which the world has been shaped in a context where their role has been systematically effaced from view. So that's to say, in a context where empire and racism have not been seen as key driving forces. So that's what decolonisation is all about. A second point from Ramgol from 2019 is about a point about pedagogy and the importance that you know, if new facts are not connected to the learner's existing experience, the result is likely to be boredom, alienation, and poor motivation. So you've got to start from where the learner's coming from. And that sense that as I said in the previous slide, that the curricula doesn't represent those views is part of, in a sense, just poor pedagogy, because you're not starting from a point of view from the learner. And then the final point is not just that, but to really think about a radical overhaul of how we consider how the knowledge is produced in the first place. Just 3 quick points here, conscious of time. So just highlight 3 points here. When thinking about decolonisation, the focus has, and particularly in the media more recently, has been very targeted at reading lists and the fact that certain thinkers are being deplatformed. Interestingly, when you look at the literature and take it more holistically, it comes out in 3 different ways. So first of all, it's identifying the continual influence of colonialism and that sort of way of thinking in academia and calling that out. Then it's working to dismantle that. And then finally thinking about and imagining and building new futures. So once we've done that, once we've sort of tried to take that out, what does a new pedagogical delivery look like? What does a new curriculum look like in that context? It's actually the complete opposite of taking things off. It's actually about enriching the curriculum. So if you're doing that, if you're decolonising the curriculum, if you're thinking practically about how is it that we create inclusive curricula which will ensure that BAME students aren't alienated from their learning, these are a couple of steps, not, as I said at the bottom, not exhaustive. So I'm sure there's a lot more work to do, and I'm sure some of you on this call have got experience in this. But the first thing is to contextualize the current curriculum. So don't just take it as a given. They don't exist inherently in anything. They're all decisions in terms of what's on the curriculum. So really put it into context. And I think that's really important. It's not just about taking people off. It's actually about saying, right, this thinker has been a core part of our curriculum for a very long time. Let's really put that into context of the time and critically assess their contribution and look at both the positive contributions, but also some of the limitations. And that's part of the second point, which is to challenge the core texts and the existing canon. So don't just assume that, we've got to rely on the founding fathers. Actually say, well, what if we don't have, the core text? What if we take a more rounded view of the way of all the contributions that have been made to the canon? The third point around challenge and reform pedagogical framework. So how the course is delivered as well needs to come into frame as part of this conversation. Fourth point is to really co-create with students. That will really get to the point, if you're co-creating with students, and obviously in this context with BAME students, to understand what is it that they want to learn, what are the things that are going to make sure that experience for them is fulfilling, as opposed to exacerbating all the other racial inequalities that they're experiencing at the institution as well. And as part of that, you will then, as the fifth point says, create parity with marginalized voices in the academy. That's the ultimate goal. That's not just about the curriculum there, that's also about recruitment and making sure that you have diverse faculty. But you really want to get to a place where it isn't just European white thinkers who are seen as the authorities on all parts of the program, of the offer, but actually there's a more diverse set of voices there. And that final point is, it may be that institutions might not all have this in-house. Work with external partners or work with other institutions to think through these things. Final point, the benefits of doing this, I guess just reiterating the points made earlier, it increases their sense of belonging at the institution, because you feel as BAME students will feel that this is an institution that is interested in their identity, interested in what they have to offer, and has tailored content for that. It empowers BAME students to take an active role in the production of knowledge, which can be hugely empowering. There's also a critical point if we really want to think about the pipeline into academia as well. If you go to an institution, you think it's just all being done to you, rather you being actively involved, you're less likely to see academia as a future and have a future there for you. It also provides academics with development opportunities. I think that's something that we don't often talk about, to expand their own horizons, expand their own knowledge. Thus, they're able to provide a better education for all students. And then finally, it benefits all students as well by giving them a more well-rounded education. So that's absolutely important, that this isn't just something for BAME students. White students are missing out from not having that broader curriculum and that broader well-rounded education. So I'll wrap it up there. Happy to take some questions, but those are the kind of key points that, this is really about ensuring that BAME students don't have an alienating experience at their institution, which leads to all sorts of challenges, which I'm sure you'll be all too familiar with. Thank you. I'll leave it there, but I think I'll be able to take some questions.
Amatey, thank you very much for that. You've packed tons of material in a very, very short period of time. So I really appreciate that. And I'm sure people will enjoy actually going back and looking at the slides, because I know because of time, you had to go through them very quickly, but we could easily have expanded your material out over a much longer time period. So I've got a few questions just to throw at you just now. One question here is, sometimes, inverted commas, change is slow in higher education. But we have shown that we can respond quite rapidly, for example, to the COVID-19 pandemic. Obviously, we made some rapid changes there. If you could see one big change, for example, in the next 12 months for BAME students and staff, what would your views be on one big change?
The big change it's a really, really good question. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the pandemic has completely thrown open this idea that institutions can't move. They can, and they've moved actually very, very quickly in lots of cases. So it's about the will and the desire and that catalyst. For me, the big change, and this might be a bit of a boring way of answering this question, it's about the infrastructure. It's governance. It's about governance and accountability and leadership. So a lot of there's a lot of good activity going on, a lot of people who are running good initiatives in parts of their institution, lots of lecturers and people on the ground who are really taking on board these ideas. But until this becomes something which is seen as an institutional priority and has the necessary coverage and governance to influence this change, there's going to be serious limitations on how much you can achieve. So if every institution would take a step back and say, okay, how do we embed this at the very top as a key strategic priority? That for me makes the biggest difference, because that will then facilitate, first of all, set expectations throughout the institution about where we're going with this, and then facilitate more activity to take place.
Well, thanks for that. Sometimes part of what comes into governance and processes is staff are all sent on unconscious bias training. I'm just wondering what your views are on unconscious bias training in general.
So I found myself in this slightly bizarre situation of agreeing with some right-wing commentators on this. Unconscious bias training doesn't work, and it's pretty out of date. But I think. And I think in a lot of cases, in some cases, reinforces some of these issues, because you're kind of left to feel powerless that, oh, I've got these biases, or there's not much I can do about them. It's far more actually about cultural competence. It's about anti-racism. It's not saying that I am somebody who is inherently biased, so I've got X, Y, Z. It's saying, no, what can I be doing proactively to make sure that I'm creating an inclusive space for the people that I work with and the students that that are attending our institution. That's a far more interesting conversation to have. And in terms of the training, then the training is about a conversation. So it's about really engaging staff to have a conversation about themselves, their own privilege, their own, their own situations and their own understandings of these issues, to build up that understanding of those capabilities, to understand, fine, what does it mean for me in the student support function? What does it mean for me as an academic to create a truly inclusive environment for my students and for those I work with?
Another question that's coming through is about the actual term, BAME or BAME, and yes, obviously it's a bit controversial and it might cause offence. What are your views on the term? Should we avoid using that term? Is there a better term or set of terminologies?
A terminology is is a tricky one. There's to put it bluntly, there's no real consensus on terminology at the moment. Whenever I work with institutions, I try and engage with what terminology is used in that context, and sometimes it reflects where the community is on these conversations. So I sort of look to respect that. There are limitations with virtually any term you use, because the inference being that you can kind of homogenize all these experiences into one. The key thing is, when you deploy the terms, or any terms that you use in a collective way, that you do so knowing that you're not trying to distill everyone down to one specific experience. You use it more as an analytical framing more than anything else. But in the actual work that you do, you seek to make sure that individuals' experiences and individual communities and intersectionalities within that are really understood and are acted upon. Yeah, but yeah, completely agree. There are limitations with all those terms. So I think whenever you use them, it's really important to caveat.
And what advice would you give to members of staff? So maybe their universities are in process of getting the governance structures in place, but here they are themselves, they want to do something just now. What would be some initial steps, do you think, that they could take as like the individual academic, and maybe they are also trying to influence up the way as well?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think seeing if you can prompt the conversations within the team, seeing if you can have the conversations about race and racism within your own team. You know, when I speak to staff and students who have had positive experiences, it's normally because they've had a specific team or a specific group of academics who've really taken this stuff seriously, and that's had a huge impact. So don't underestimate your impact that you can have on students if you personally and your team members personally take this seriously. It can have a huge impact. You know, even if the wider institution isn't potentially taking it as seriously as you might like, and then keep you know, banging the drum, really, if you have the privilege and can have access to those spaces and have the ear of individuals who may have more power in the system to affect change here. Use that and use it to really platform these ideas and to create change.
I'm back to another question that maybe is a bit about language and terminology again. So somebody's put in, so the University of Manchester last year had a report on race in the UK, and it pointed out about the necessity of talking about whiteness, not only race and racism in general. So what are your thoughts about talking about whiteness?
Well, I think this goes into the actually goes into the question about training. One of the really good things, and I've just done a report for an institution about looking at racism, and one of our recommendations was around really good, you know, they need to get really good anti-racism training. As part of that training, that is when people can sit down and understand what these terms mean, and you know, whether we're talking about microaggressions, whether we're talking about you know, whiteness is a very good example. You know, you need to have a conversation just to unpack those terms and what they mean and how they manifest themselves. They're incredibly useful ways of understanding how these inequalities perpetuate. But I think without the context of a safe environment and a safe space and time to really unpack these issues, I think sometimes people just find them a bit confronting and try and dismiss them. So I think every institution needs to think, you know, how can we create those spaces where staff, and again, not just in a one-off sense, over a period of time, can understand what these terms are and can really get to grips and you know, really develop their capabilities of understanding on what race and racism is and how it manifests itself.
And I think I've just got time for one last question here. Again, maybe it's a bit about language, and I think challenging other people's language. So, you know, how would you recommend that staff challenge maybe bigoted or racist behaviours or comments that they might, you know, hear from other colleagues in the workplace?
Yeah, I've had this question before, and a slightly frustrating answer from me on this, which is that this is why you need good training, because you need good training not just to make these incidents less likely, but going up to somebody and calling out some behavior and saying, look, I think what you've done is really offensive. It's so much easier to do if you know that they've had a session where this stuff has been spelled out to them in no uncertain terms. So all you're doing is referring them back to a previous conversation, saying, look, I think what you're doing is an example of an XYZ. And frankly, you know, we've had this conversation, you've had this conversation, this is not acceptable. It also allows institutions to have much more authority, to be much more robust in cracking down on sort of unacceptable behaviors, because they know that everybody's had the education to understand what they mean. It's very difficult in one interaction to both call out a specific thing that has happened and then also try and educate that person on why that behavior is problematic and give them a kind of history lesson about racism and race and the rest of it, particularly then if that person is coming from a background where, you know, they don't really think this stuff is much of an issue and, you know, it's political correctness gone mad, that kind of thing. So that's why I think that training is super important. But in the absence of that, it's about really trying to, you know, explain to people very clearly why it is that their behavior is harmful and hurtful. It's not just saying you shouldn't say that because it's offensive. Try, if you can, and I'll caveat this by saying it's not really the responsibility if it's a person of color doing this. But I think if it's a white person who can use their privilege to call somebody out, trying to explain to them, you know, this is what you said, this is why it's problematic, this is how it might be perceived, and this is what the impact might be on individuals. And if you can walk them through that, I think it's much more effective than just sort of calling them out without any broader context. So
agree. Great, thank you very much. No, thank you very much for, you know, both your presentation and the discussion there with the questions. There are other questions that I can see in the chat. We don't have time to go through them just now, but I don't know if Amatey, you felt like writing answers in the chat.
Sure.
just now, that's up to you. But no, just thank you very much for your time. That's great. But I'm afraid we need to move on to Dominic just now, if that's okay. Dom, I'm hoping you're kind of getting yourself lined up in the background, and if you're able to share your slides just now.
I think I'm good to go.
Yep, that's great. Okay, so I know you'll give more of an introduction yourself, but, you know, thank you very much for coming along. So, you know, you're working from Student Minds, and I'm sure you'll just explain to us a wee bit more just now about what your day job is. So I'll hand over to you just now. Thanks, Dom. Great.
Well, thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Dom Smithies. I'm the Student Voice and Equality Lead at Student Minds. To those of you who haven't heard of us before, we're the UK's student mental health charity. So we work across the UK, kind of in the intersection between the higher education and the health sectors. Think about student mental health quite broadly, and think about how we can improve student mental health across a range of domains and through a range of programs. I would recommend, just in the gift of time, rather than me giving you a nice 5-minute intro to what we do as an organisation, do check out our resources, our programs, our website at your leisure. Lots of stuff you can find out about all kinds of work we do on there. But to those of you who have engaged with Student Minds before, welcome back. And yeah, I'm excited to get into talking about the experience of LGBTQ students today. So briefly, just the 3 main things I want to be covering are talking about the key issues that broadly come up for the LGBTQ community as a whole, and then focusing in on the experience of LGBTQ students, how they experience higher education. And also I'm going to try and touch upon their experiences this past year. It's been an interesting 12 months, and yeah, it's affected many within the student population in different ways. I think it's really interesting to reflect on some of the learnings that have come from that already. And then some brief points, I think, from what we already know is good practice and things to be mindful of in creating curriculum and learning spaces that are helpful and empowering for LGBTQ students. But I think much will echo probably a lot of the principles that Amatey just set out in his presentation too. So to jump right in, quickly, I'm always conscious when I'm talking about various different aspects of student populations and subpopulations within the student population that it can come across as homogenizing, and I think there's a real risk when we talk about specific populations that you can make a lot of assumptions about populations' needs or challenges they face or risk factors they have, and protective factors as well. I think it's really important that we are mindful that often it's a case with risk and with protective factors that a lot of the intersections and a lot of the layering of different aspects of individuals' identities is what really makes up who they are and can expose them to a range of challenges and heighten levels of risk when it comes to their mental health being affected, how they experience education. So while I'm going to generally talk about the LGBTQ population and try and pull out key themes, key learning of what we know about their common experience as a whole, I do just want to, I suppose, initially preface and caveat in saying across all of this work, we should all be trying to be mindful of the various intersections that exist across the student population. So to get right in, to talk about the LGBTQ community as a whole, I feel my existence in watching the news, reading press pieces, engaging on social media, often a lot of the recurring, fairly fatiguing debates that I'm seeing going on often have the LGBTQ population at the centre. So I'm just going to touch on a few current or recurring issues that seem to constantly come up, not necessarily associated with higher education, but I think there will be some intersections that will be useful to reflect on. So the idea of self-identification, it's not something that's unique to the LGBTQ population. The idea of being able to identify into, I suppose, different characteristics comes up particularly around gender identity. I was at a conference just last week where we were talking about social class and how there's debate around whether that's something people can self-identify into, or whether that's something that's a bit more objective and prescriptive, and then how do you measure it? And the concept of self-identification is something that is, I think, often mocked in a lot of media. It's definitely challenged by lots of groups. How it intersects with aspects like healthcare, getting access to healthcare, particularly when it comes to gender reassignment and getting treatment through NHS, with gatekeeping of doctors currently kind of holding the power and being able to diagnose whether someone has gender dysphoria and is trans and therefore qualifies to get healthcare treatment. It's an issue that does have lots of impact on the LGBTQ population, but goes a lot broader as well. Issue of free speech came up not that many weeks ago yet again. The concept of no platforming, government proposing to bring in a free speech champion to police to fine the sector being autonomous in how it debates what and who it invites. I'm not going to go too much into this, but I have lots of thoughts on the free speech debate. I think often in cases where free speech hasn't been upheld, when you really look into the details, it doesn't often seem to be anything too substantial. Oftentimes, at least in my experience back at my institution, when we were in the news of no platforming and free speech not happening, it was often a case of inviting a speaker, then giving societies a budget that the societies couldn't afford, and then being like, sorry, we can't afford you. And then the speaker capitalizing on the free speech momentum to talk about how there'd been no platformed, when in reality students just couldn't afford to bring them in. Lots of issues around this come up. There is some obviously serious academic aspects within this that we do need to be mindful of, but the LGBTQ and I think the trans populations often get caught up in these debates with it. Often academics and speakers who are gender critical, using in inverted commas, can often be found to be very finely towing the line, or sometimes not finely at all, between academic debate and promoting hate speech. And the line that universities have to straddle in identifying the two is challenging. And the other one, I think Amatey already touched across representation in higher education quite well, but I'm briefly just going to mention representation in media. I think is so important. More of it is ultimately good, because it means that where representation isn't ideal or it's clumsy, at least there's other instances where people can see people, that they're able to get a more holistic sense of what a population is like. I think a particular challenge with working in higher education is for a lot of students, with the average age of coming out currently in the UK being about 18, a lot of young people won't have that many instances of knowing LGBTQ people in their lives. Most of their kind of cultural knowledge of who LGBTQ people are will come from media, and role models they may or may not have in their family or in school. So that's the broad challenges, but to go on a bit of a deeper dive for students, with a couple of initial caveats. Firstly, that the research really on LGBTQ identity and mental health is very limited, largely due to societal attitudes, legislation, and also down to how LGBTQ identities were kind of recognised in psychology as historically not necessarily being like a social aspect of one's identity or personality, but could be something that has been seen as disordered or an illness. So a lot of literature can carry lots of bias, and the inflation can make it all very unreliable. And then another point which I always love to talk about, being that engaging authentically with understanding LGBTQ's young people's, students' mental health and their challenges is difficult, because often people who are open and comfortable with their identity are likely to experience fewer mental health difficulties, have high resilience, be able to deal with stress better. So those engaging with research are already comfortable with their identities, are probably actually going to give a lower reflection than what is the reality for the broad population. So even though lots of literature is fairly damning when it comes to looking at LGBTQ populations, mental health outcomes, actually there's lots of academic grounding to say that's probably an underrepresentation of what the reality is as well. I'm not going to go into detail of lots of literature that's out there. I'll pick out a few key points on my next current slides, but I'm just going to reference to, I think, some of my favourite reports and a couple of academic pieces that will give you all the necessary overviews that I think you need if you do want to look at this more. I'm sure slides are being sent out, so I won't give a brief introduction to all of these papers. I'd recommend that you all just, at your leisure, look at them if you're interested in finding out more when the slides get shared. But just to pull out some of the key points that come across, we know LGBTQ individuals have different experiences when it comes to their mental health than their counterparts, particularly prevalence of developing mental health difficulties in terms of diagnoses, particularly struggling with self-esteem, body confidence, self-harming behaviour, suicidal ideation, substance abuse, loneliness and isolation. All of that mostly coming from a range of risk factors, often a case of experiencing or witnessing, indirectly experiencing any kind of queer phobia, having to manage a range of norms, manage their identity, and be comfortable in spaces that aren't for them. I'm not going to go into this slide either, but I think this is possibly the most comprehensive write-up of a range of not just risk factors, but protective factors as well. I think when we talk about health inequalities, we often get very stuck in looking at all the risk factors and thinking about how we can minimize them and manage them. But often I think the really valuable and empowering role higher education can play is thinking about what protective factors we know to exist and to work, how we can build more of those into the education experience for students. So just to pick out a couple of examples, LGBTQ communities, societies, networks, spaces where LGBTQ people can meet other LGBTQ people is such a huge and important protective factor, and it's something that many universities and student unions do really well to facilitate, giving students that space to meet others, to connect, to have other people like them that know their experience, that share their experience, that can also support them when some things negative may be affecting them. So thinking not just about the risk factors and how to minimize them, but looking at all the things we can do to protect the community, enhance their experience, I think is really important. So do go more into this at your leisure when slides go around. I hope there's some useful ideas and tips in there that you'll be able to pull out. And apologies that I can't go into much more detail. Some research we did just a couple of years ago. It feels like over a decade. Time's an abstract concept this year. But just a few headlines from it. With students, we got quite a bimodal distribution when it came to students talking about how involved they get in the LGBTQ community. So that's both the university or student union kind of society or network, and also the wider local community, with students being completely split in either fully getting involved in that community or not getting engaged at all. So there's questions being raised about perceptions of inclusivity, how welcoming those spaces are, and there are things, recommendations in this report that societies can do to make them more welcoming spaces. But the majority of LGBTQ students feel that there is a need for more support. There's currently a bit of a gap and something lacking, whether that's targeted interventions or current provision being more inclusive, or just improving access to a range of provisions. That all came out quite strongly. And when it came to help-seeking behaviours, something we know to be true is that students and young people, first and foremost, will most likely seek help and reach out to and disclose to their friends and their peers, much more than anyone else. And they're also most likely to have the best experiences from their friends and peers, not necessarily clinically, but just in getting the messaging, the support at the point they need it. It can have a really huge impact. Potentially unsurprisingly, parents didn't do so well when it came to the helpfulness. Not so much to say parents aren't always as good, but there was quite significant variance in how well LGBTQ young people feel they're getting good support from their parents, with many getting absolutely as good support as their non-LGBTQ counterparts, but many also have some seriously negative, harmful experiences when disclosing to their parents and talking about their experience and seeking help. Fortunately, experience with counsellors is generally positive. There is some variance. There are some things to work on. There was some stuff that came through in the qualitative data that highlighted some really harmful, adverse, concerning experiences and things to work on. But broadly, I think it was actually quite positive around counselling and clinical support. But there was a fair bit of mentioning around, similar to Amatey's points mentioned earlier, having LGBTQ counsellors or kind of visible role models that they could look up to in order to get support they need. To touch upon some of the main things that have come through in the last year, there's a report that came out from oh goodness, I'm drawing a blank. I think I might have on the next slide. No, I don't. I want to say the LGBT Foundation, their Hidden Figures report that was looking at experiences of LGBTQ communities, so not student specific, but they do look at the young populations quite a lot. Quite a lot came up around healthcare, around challenges with education, around feeling isolated, looking particularly to student issues. Have put in bold a few things that we've echoed from this report. So struggling with mental health, feeling isolated, the challenge of being in an environment, a home environment, which is also their learning environment, where they might not be able to be their authentic self, might be experiencing kind of discrimination, harassment, potentially abuse, or just generally an unwelcoming environment. we know not being able to be authentic isn't conducive to a good learning environment or good living environment in general. So it's important to be mindful of the impact coronavirus has had on this community the past year. Access to healthcare, a really significant one, but I'm not going to go too much into detail on that one here. Just to whiz on to some things that have been useful and some things I think are important to be mindful of when looking at our curriculum designing. There have been some positives that students have spoken to us about. So using software like Zoom or just general digital environments, the ability for people to be a lot clearer with their pronouns, their preferred name, rather than having to generally in a seminar kind of disclose that when someone's reading through the register, having it visibly there as a prompt for people is actually people have felt it's been used more, people slip up less, and the effort they have to put in correcting people is lowered just because it's right in front of you. Lots of people generally feeling learning environment digitally has been more inclusive and accessible, and similarly with support as well. And just as a final few things, I think I'd echo much of what Amatey already mentioned around the principles. The idea of safe spaces is something that comes up a fair bit in literature and in conversations that we have with students. And what I mean by that, I know it can be quite a loaded term in discourse in the sector at the moment, but creating environments where people can essentially just be their authentic selves, feel comfortable being their authentic selves, and they're free from experiencing discrimination, harassment, abuse, microaggressions. I've linked to a TED talk in there that just undermine that comfort and their validity to be in those spaces. Absolutely, the role of having visible role models, staff representation across management in higher education, really important. Curriculum, I think Amatey already did a great job in covering lots of that. Some courses where lack of specific inclusive curriculum can actually be harmful. I think it's been cut off by my line breaker there. But in courses like healthcare and psychology, historically, which haven't always done a great job at talking about LGBTQ populations and mental health and health needs, can actually result in some really serious negative health outcomes for a range of populations. So curriculum is really seriously important in a range of courses. And there's lots more research to be done. There are some colleagues at University of Derby who have been looking at trans experiences within curriculum and pedagogy and course design. I think they're doing a couple of surveys at the moment, so do check their work out. Very much looking forward to hearing from them. But I think that's me at time, so I'm going to stop whittling on, and I look forward to having some questions.
That's great, Dom. Thank you very much. Again, you've got loads of material there that we can go back to, and lots of resources as well, which is fantastic. So we've got a few questions coming in the chat here, and others can feel free to post in some more as well. So, I mean, in our audience today, we've got a mixture of academic staff, professional support services staff, and we've got students here as well. And one question coming in is, what advice and support would you give to an international student who has arrived from a country that perhaps isn't so accepting of LGBTQ plus communities?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think also a great example of looking at that intersection of an experience when you're looking at a couple of identities that overlap and intersect is when you can get a really interesting dynamic, and you need to think about much more tailored and nuanced, potentially targeted support. I think it is a challenging one. It's hard to give advice that isn't just generalizing, obviously, internationally the range of societal and cultural attitudes and laws that exist that are still negative. It's hard without knowing the context in which they come from specifically, because international covers the rest of the world, obviously. But thinking about how you can welcome those students into communities, welcome them into spaces, find ways where they can, within the bubble of, I suppose, higher education, be their authentic self, meet others similar to them, even within the international population specifically, I think can be really valuable. Thinking about, I suppose, what the role is of institutions to make sure those students are being safe and protecting themselves. I know there's lots of anxiety when it comes to social media, what's seen, particularly back in the days when Facebook was really active. Accidentally being tagged in a photo where you were at an event can suddenly out you to all of your family, and it's obviously not something that's harmful, very accidental and easily done in the days of social media and being public. So making sure students being empowered with the knowledge of how to, I suppose, control what they do share on social media and what they share publicly, so they can manage and hold on to who they do and don't disclose aspects of their identity to. We know that's such an important factor when it comes to being LGBTQ, and is the responsibility of concealment and having control over whether you do and when you do disclose being LGBTQ. Also conscious it does carry with it a lot of stress. I mean, being naive, I would love to advocate for everyone just being able to be their full authentic selves. We know that to have good health outcomes, but obviously that reeks of privilege to say that, because people do have families back home, and family is so important as well. But familial acceptance is something that's important, and I'm just optimistic over time attitudes will continue to change as they have been over the last few decades, but we need to make a lot more progress globally too. But it's a challenging one. That's a good question.
Yeah, exactly. Another question coming through is, any suggestions for maybe events an individual department could maybe organize to support outside of the curriculum to increase the feeling of sense of belonging and inclusivity for, well, both LGBTQ plus communities and BAME students as well is in the question. But what types of events, if anything, would you suggest for departments, or is this something should we leave this to the Students Association, or what are your thoughts around about this?
Yeah, great question. I do think student unions, student associations have a long and proud history of doing great work when it comes to creating spaces, events, communities for a range of, I suppose, the minority and marginalised populations. So collaborating with them where you can. I know quite a lot of departments do lots to celebrate the various history months and try to tie in ways of looking at integrating what you're teaching through whatever department, whatever course, celebrating academics and work and literature during that month in particular, so people can particularly feel welcome and visible and represented in that course, in that community. So play a specific role in thinking about how you welcome minority students into your department, making them feel seen and visible, I think is really, really important. So the history months, absolutely really valuable, but I also think just in the core messaging that goes out in just your welcomes when students arrive, and talking to students in kind of your one-to-ones, personal tutoring, in your lectures, there's just lots of messaging that can normalize things like using pronouns, letting people self-identify with their gender identity, being mindful of a range of things. And I think it's in those subtle behaviors that I think actually play much more of a role in making people feel welcome. And it's similar to how Amatey said, knowing people have gone to training, you can feel it, you can tell when it's happened. I think it really comes through, and students will experience the benefits of it.
You've linked in perfectly to the next question here. I mean, particularly bearing in mind, you said earlier that if the average age of coming out is age 18, the kind of stage when students are starting university, you know, what sort of training do you think, you know, academic staff, particularly, you know, personal tutoring staff should undergo? In regards to anything around about the LGBT, making sure that they're making students feel included and they don't inadvertently alienate or exclude. If there was to be some kind of training, what sort of things do you think should be in that training for staff?
Oh, good question. I'm hesitant to recommend any training for fear of me recommending something that I think has been valuable and it not being positive for any individuals. I don't think there is any silver bullet of resources or content or training that will be good. I think, again, echoing Amatey's point, I think often what's useful in things like the unconscious bias training, or I saw someone mention a question just before we switched over around active bystander training. Often it's not the content that you'll get on the slides or in the booklet or whatever you're getting on the day. I think often what's really valuable is having this time and space to have the conversations. I think what's really important in having those conversations is making sure they're well facilitated and making sure people with experiences, obviously, that they're happy to share and talk about where they have experienced discrimination or harassment, giving time and space for people to share those experiences and have people listen about those experiences, get challenged on their privilege, be able to ask questions. I know some people can feel very uncomfortable about when is the appropriate time to ask questions. Often it comes from a place of, I suppose, innocent curiosity, but for lots of minorities, they're put in a position where they're constantly educating those around them. So often I think it's just creating the dedicated times and spaces where you can be having the conversations. I don't think there's any particular training that'll do it. You get a good facilitator in a room and the right students, right staff with the right experiences, and I think people will come away feeling enriched.
Yeah, thank you very much. I am aware of time, so I'm afraid I'll have to stop the conversations there just now. But just to say a massive thank you, Dominic, to yourself and to Amatey as well for for some fantastic presentations and some thought-provoking Q&A sessions as well, with some practical points for us to consider. Thank you everyone for joining with us today and contributing questions into the chat. As I mentioned at the beginning, the recording of the session will be made available on our cluster webpage, and please feel free to circulate the link to that widely round about your networks as you see fit. And we'll get to you soon the date for the second webinar in our series. But just to say thank you once again to our speakers and everyone today. Thank you very much.